I used to think my grandparents were the only people in my family who truly understood me. While my parents were always consumed with appearances, social circles, and the constant chase for status, Grandma and Grandpa were my safe place. Their home in the countryside was more than a getaway. It was the only place where I could breathe. Every summer, I'd spend weeks there, helping Grandma bake cinnamon bread in her old kitchen, or watching Grandpa tinker in his workshop while soft jazz played on his dusty radio. They'd tell me stories about how they built their life from nothing, how love and honesty were the only wealth they truly valued. I believed them. I believed that love was something that could never be taken away. But life has a way of teaching you that even the purest bonds can be rewritten by greed. When Grandpa fell ill, the world seemed to slow down. I visited every weekend, watching him fade but still smiling for my sake. He'd squeeze my hand and say, "You've got my heart, Lily. You're the only one who remembers what really matters." I never understood what he meant back then. I thought it was just another one of his tender affirmations, something to comfort me. But later I realized it was a warning. The week he passed, the house that once smelled of warmth and cinnamon now felt cold, hollow. My parents, Thomas and Margaret, were emotionless at the funeral, whispering among themselves about property transitions and financial paperwork. I couldn't even bring myself to think about that. All I could think of was the empty rocking chair by the window, the one where Grandpa used to sit with his tea and hum old war songs. 2 weeks later, the lawyer invited us to the reading of the will. I didn't expect anything. I wasn't raised to. Grandpa had always said he wanted me to live freely, to find happiness on my own terms. Still, as I sat in that oak-paneled office, surrounded by family portraits and the scent of old paper, I felt an uneasy stillness. The lawyer, Mr. Collins, adjusted his glasses and began reading. His voice echoed through the room like the toll of a distant bell. All assets and property shall be divided equally among Thomas and his wife, Margaret. I blinked, waiting for more, waiting for my name. But it never came. I felt a rush of heat crawl up my neck. Surely there was a mistake. Grandpa had always told me, "You'll never be forgotten, Lily." But in that moment, that's exactly what it felt like. I'd been erased. My father smiled, a quiet, victorious smile that made my stomach twist. My mother dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, pretending to mourn, though her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. My older brother, Evan, leaned back smugly in his chair, already calculating what he could do with the extra money. I sat there, silent, pretending to be composed, but inside I was trembling. The air felt heavy, suffocating. When Mr. Collins closed the folder, my father patted me on the shoulder. "Don't take it personally, Lily. Your grandparents wanted to keep things simple." Simple. That word echoed like mockery. I excused myself before I broke down right there in front of them. After the meeting, I found Grandma sitting alone in the car, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. She looked smaller, frailer than I'd ever seen her. I slid into the seat beside her and whispered, "Grandma, why wasn't I in the will?" For a moment, she didn't respond. Then she looked at me with watery eyes and forced a weak smile. "It was for the best, dear. Your father knows what he's doing. He'll take care of everything." Her voice shook. It wasn't conviction, it was fear. The words sounded rehearsed, as if she'd been told exactly what to say. I wanted to press her, to demand the truth, but I saw how exhausted she was, and I stopped myself. "Okay, Grandma," I said softly, though the word burned in my throat. "If you say so." That night I couldn't sleep. The more I thought about the will, the more it didn't make sense. Grandpa was meticulous. He believed in fairness, in documentation, in doing the right thing no matter what. He would never have left me out entirely. And Grandma's reaction? That wasn't guilt-free. That was a woman trapped between love and manipulation. I tossed and turned until 2 a.m., then finally gave in to the restlessness. I got in my car and drove to their old countryside house. It was dark and silent, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. The front door creaked open when I turned the knob. Grandma never did remember to lock it. I stepped inside, and the familiar smell of old books and lavender hit me like a ghost of childhood. I wandered through the living room, touching the arm of the sofa, the chipped photo frames, and the cold teapot still sitting on the counter. Every corner of that house carried a memory. The attic had always been my favorite spot as a child. It was where Grandpa stored all his forgotten treasures, as he called them, boxes of journals, old photographs, and knickknacks from their travels. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was instinct, but I climbed the creaky wooden stairs and pulled the chain to light the single bulb overhead. Dust particles floated in the air like tiny ghosts. I started rummaging through boxes, old family albums, yellowed newspapers, faded holiday cards. Then, beneath a blanket of cobwebs, I saw a small wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox, with my name carved faintly into the lid, Lily. My breath caught. I brushed away the dust and opened it carefully. Inside were bundles of letters tied with twine, each one addressed to me, in Grandpa's handwriting. My heart raced as I picked up the first one. It was dated 6 months before his death. The paper was fragile, the ink slightly smudged, but his words were unmistakable. If you're reading this, Lily, then the truth was buried before I could speak it. My hands trembled. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it echo in the quiet attic. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of my grandparents' past, and read on. Your father came to me last winter. He spoke of the will of wanting to simplify matters. But what he truly meant was to control everything. Your grandmother, she's been unwell, and I fear he's using that to his advantage. I've tried to reason with her, but she's frightened, manipulated. I'm writing these letters to you so that, if anything happens, you'll know it wasn't my choice. I gasped. My throat tightened, tears pooling in my eyes. Grandpa had known. He'd seen it coming. My father had pressured them to change the will, taking advantage of Grandma's fragile mind. I flipped through the letters, each one painting a clearer picture of betrayal. How my father had intercepted phone calls, persuaded Grandma to sign documents under the guise of legal updates, and dismissed anyone who questioned him. I couldn't breathe. The air felt too thick. I pressed a hand to my mouth to stifle a sob. My father, the man who had lectured me all my life about family values and loyalty, had stolen not only money, but dignity from his own parents. And Grandma, she'd gone along with it, maybe out of fear, maybe out of confusion. I read until dawn, my tears staining the pages. Every word hurt, but they also lit a fire inside me, a fire of clarity. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about truth. Grandpa's last act wasn't leaving me money. It was leaving me evidence, proof of who they'd become and who I needed to be. When I finally left the attic, the sun was rising over the peach trees outside. The same trees Grandpa had planted the year I was born. The air was crisp, the world painted gold. I stood there for a long time, holding the letters against my chest. I felt like a piece of him was still with me, whispering through the morning breeze. As I locked the house behind me, I whispered, I'll find the truth, Grandpa. I promise. That promise echoed in my heart as I drove away. I didn't know what awaited me, but I knew one thing for certain. They could change the will, erase my name, even rewrite their lies. But they couldn't erase the truth that my grandfather had left behind. And for the first time since he died, I didn't feel powerless. I felt chosen. The morning after I discovered Grandpa's letters felt unreal. I woke up on my couch surrounded by open envelopes, the floor littered with pages that carried his fading handwriting. The sunlight filtering through the blinds felt wrong, too bright for what I had just learned. My grandfather's neat, deliberate script seemed to speak to me even in silence, the ink itself a whisper from beyond the grave. Each letter connected to the next like a trail of breadcrumbs, leading deeper into a labyrinth my family had built on lies. By the time I finished the 5th letter, I realized that what my parents had done wasn't just a mistake or misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act of manipulation, a betrayal wrapped in paperwork and forged signatures. I spent that morning rereading every word. Grandpa's tone shifted subtly between the letters, from love and protection to worry and then resignation. In one, dated a few months before his death, he wrote, "Your father sees the world through ownership, not love. He cannot separate care from control. When I am gone, he will try to own what cannot be owned, our legacy. Don't let him bury what's sacred." I read that line again and again until my eyes blurred. What was sacred? What exactly had he wanted to protect? That question haunted me as I made coffee I couldn't drink and stared at my reflection in the kitchen window. My face looked older overnight, hollowed by realization. The letters weren't just confessions, they were instructions. Grandpa had left me the truth, and with it, a responsibility. I couldn't pretend ignorance anymore. I couldn't unsee the handwriting or unread the warnings. I had to know how deep my father's deceit ran. The first place I went was the law firm that had handled Grandpa's affairs for decades. The office had changed little since the will reading. Same oak furniture, same faint smell of polished leather and old paper. Mr. Collins, the lawyer who'd read the will, greeted me with polite surprise. "Lily," he said cautiously, "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I need to ask about the will," I said, trying to sound steady. "The version that was read, was it the only one?" His expression tightened. "Your grandmother signed the final document 6 months before your grandfather's passing. Everything was handled according to legal standards." "Legal standards?" I repeated bitterly. "What about ethical ones?" He hesitated. I could tell he didn't want to say more, maybe couldn't. So I tried another route. "What about Mr. Keating? He handled my grandparents' affairs before you, right?" He blinked, surprised I knew the name. "Yes, but he retired a few years ago. Moved north, I think. Why?" "Because I think he might know something about the original will," I said quietly. "The one before my father got involved." His eyes darted away for a moment before he replied. "If there were another version, I wouldn't be at liberty to discuss it. But," he paused, lowering his voice, "Mr. Keating was an honest man. If anyone could help you find clarity, it would be him." That was all I needed to hear. It took me 2 days to find Mr. Keating. He lived in a small coastal town, retired but still sharp. When he opened the door, recognition flickered in his eyes. "Lily," he asked. "Good heavens, you've grown. I haven't seen you since your grandfather's anniversary party." He invited me in, and over tea, I told him everything about the new will, the letters, the uneasy feeling that something was terribly wrong. He listened quietly, his hands folded over his cane, his brow furrowed deeper with each word. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "I always feared this," he said softly. "Your grandfather was a man of integrity. The will I drafted for him reflected that. You were included, Lily, substantially. Half of his personal assets and the charitable trust were to be managed in your name. But a few months before he passed, your father came to me insisting that the document be updated. He claimed your grandmother wanted to simplify matters." I felt my stomach twist. "Did she?" He hesitated. "When I visited her, she seemed confused, not entirely lucid. I refused to proceed unless she confirmed her consent in writing, which she couldn't. Shortly after, your father replaced me with another lawyer." The room spun slightly. It was confirmation. Everything Grandpa had written in his letters was true. My father had coerced Grandma into signing a fraudulent will, taking advantage of her memory loss and emotional instability. My pulse hammered as I realized how premeditated it all was. "Do you still have a copy of the original?" I asked, gripping the edge of my chair. "I shouldn't," he said, then looked at me for a long time. "But Harold was a friend, not just a client. I kept one for safekeeping." He stood, walked to a small filing cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a folder yellowed with age. Inside were pages stamped and signed, carrying my grandfather's unmistakable signature. He handed it to me. "If you decide to pursue this, be careful," he warned. "The truth can cost more than silence." I nodded, though my throat tightened with emotion. "Thank you," I whispered. When I returned home, I spread the documents across my table like puzzle pieces. The more I compared them to the new will, the more obvious the forgery became. The signatures didn't match perfectly. The phrasing was slightly off, and one page, ironically the one removing me from the inheritance, had a different notary stamp dated weeks after Grandpa's hospitalization. My father hadn't even tried to hide the manipulation well. He counted on obedience, on everyone accepting his word as law, but he didn't count on me. That night, I went back to the countryside house, determined to find anything else Grandpa might have left behind. The house creaked in protest as I stepped through the door. I made my way to his study, a room I'd always been told to stay out of as a child. The scent of cedar and old books filled the air. His desk was immaculate, every pen aligned, papers stacked neatly. But when I tugged at the bottom drawer, it wouldn't budge. Something was jamming it. I pulled harder, and a wooden panel slid loose. Behind it, wedged between the inner frame and the backboard, was a small flash drive wrapped in masking tape. I held it up to the light, my pulse racing. Grandpa had been old-fashioned. He barely used computers. For him to have a flash drive meant whatever was on it mattered deeply. I drove straight home, plugged it into my laptop, and waited. The drive contained 3 folders labeled Truth, Records, and Voice. My hands trembled as I opened them. The first contained scans of financial statements, transactions between my father and multiple accounts that clearly didn't belong to him. The second folder held digital copies of legal documents, including the original will and a series of handwritten notes Grandpa had scanned. One of them read, "If they ever tell you that you are not part of this family, remember, you are the conscience they feared." The last folder contained audio files. When I clicked play, Grandpa's voice filled the room, weak but steady. "If you're hearing this, Lily, it means I didn't get the chance to make things right. Your father believes legacy is measured in wealth. He doesn't understand that it's measured in truth. Don't let him convince you otherwise." Tears rolled down my cheeks as I listened. He had recorded these while he was dying, knowing my father would silence him. His trust in me, even from beyond the grave, cut deeper than any betrayal ever could. I sat there for hours replaying the recordings, memorizing every pause, every breath, every word of love and warning. For days afterward, I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to storm into my parents' mansion and throw the evidence on the table. Another part wanted to disappear, to escape the chaos, to let them rot in their lies. But the letters, the voice files, the weight of Grandpa's trust, none of it would let me rest. One night, as I stared at the flickering city lights outside my window, his final words echoed in my head. They already destroyed themselves the moment they chose deceit. I realized then that exposing them wasn't about revenge, it was about restoration. Grandpa had built his life on integrity, and my father had dismantled it for greed. The least I could do was rebuild it with truth. I made copies of everything, the documents, the letters, the recordings, and placed them in separate folders. One set went to Mr. Keating for safekeeping. Another I locked in a bank deposit box under my name. Then I took a deep breath and called the ethics division of the state legal board. If I was going to do this, I had to do it right. The next morning, I mailed an anonymous package to the authorities containing evidence of document forgery and financial manipulation. My hands shook as I sealed the envelope. I wasn't sure what would come next, lawsuits, scandals, broken relationships, but I felt lighter. For the first time in months, I slept through the night. When I woke, I opened Grandpa's final letter again. It ended with a line I hadn't noticed before. "The truth will hurt, Lily, but it will also heal. They can change the papers, but they can't erase your name from what's right." I smiled through tears. I understood now. Grandpa hadn't just left me an inheritance. He'd left me a mission. The storm was coming, and I was ready to face it. The day I decided to act, the sky was gray. Quiet, heavy, waiting. It felt as if even the weather understood the weight of what I was about to do. I stood by my window, the box of Grandpa's letters open on the table beside me, and realized I wasn't afraid anymore. For weeks, I'd been trapped between fury and heartbreak, paralyzed by what my family had done. But grief has a strange way of burning itself into purpose. That morning, I finally found mine. I gathered everything. The forged documents, the original will, the recordings, the bank statements. Every piece of evidence was a fragment of the truth my father had buried under years of manipulation and deceit. I placed them neatly in a folder, sealed it shut, and drove to Mr. Keating's house. When he opened the door, his face softened in quiet understanding. "You're ready," he said. I nodded. "Then we'll do this the right way." He helped me file a formal complaint with the state's Legal Ethics Board and the Financial Crimes Division. I didn't want a scandal, but I also couldn't let this rot in silence. Grandpa's words haunted me. They already destroyed themselves the moment they chose deceit. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. The investigation began quietly, but word spread fast within our town. My father's colleagues, once eager to bask in his self-importance, began to whisper. My mother avoided calls, terrified of the humiliation she'd spent her life trying to avoid. And Grandma, sweet, fragile Grandma, looked more like a ghost than a person. When I visited her during the early days of the inquiry, she sat in her armchair staring out the window, her hands trembling in her lap. "Why did you do it?" I asked softly, sitting beside her. She didn't look at me at first. "Your father said it was for the family," she whispered, her voice quivering. "He told me Harold wanted to make things simple, to keep it in one piece." "But he lied," I said, fighting the lump in my throat. "He used you, Grandma. He used your love." She finally turned toward me, her eyes filled with tears. "I know, and I'll never forgive myself for believing him." She reached out and took my hand. "He destroyed everything Harold built, didn't he?" I swallowed hard. "Not everything," I said. "I'm going to put it back together." That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of my apartment sounded like the echo of my parents' voices, cold, dismissive, proud. I remembered every time my father had made me feel small, every time my mother had told me to know my place. But now I realized they had no power left. The truth had stripped them bare. A week later, the authorities called both of us in for questioning. I arrived first, clutching the folder like armor. My parents entered 15 minutes later. My mother in her expensive coat, her face drawn but defiant. My father with that same air of false confidence he wore to every business meeting. When he saw me, he smirked. "I hope you realize what you're doing, Lily. You're tearing this family apart." I met his gaze evenly. "You already did that when you forged Grandpa's will," he scoffed. "You think anyone will believe a pile of letters and your childish accusations? You always were dramatic." But when the investigator laid out the documents, the digital files and Grandpa's recordings, the color drained from his face. For the first time I saw fear flicker behind his eyes. My mother shifted uncomfortably beside him, her hands gripping her purse. Grandma had also provided a statement, admitting that she'd been manipulated into signing papers she didn't understand. "He told me Harold wanted this," she'd confessed tearfully. "But it was all his idea." The evidence was undeniable. The financial records showed money transferred from the charitable trust into my father's personal accounts. The notary stamp on the fake will was proven to have been issued weeks after my grandfather's hospitalization, when he was too sick to consent to anything. Piece by piece, the lies unraveled until there was nothing left to hide behind. The hearing stretched on for months, but every session brought me closer to the truth being recognized. My father's arrogance turned to desperation. He tried to blame the lawyers, the accountants, even Grandma. When that didn't work, he turned on me. "You've embarrassed this family," he shouted one afternoon outside the courthouse. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed my career." I looked at him steadily. "No, Dad. You destroyed it the moment you betrayed Grandpa's trust. I just stopped you from burying it with him." He stood there speechless, for once unable to twist words to his advantage. My mother avoided my eyes completely, as though by not looking at me she could erase me from her world. When the final verdict came, it was quiet and formal. The court ruled in favor of reinstating the original will and recognized my father's actions as document tampering and financial fraud. He was fined heavily, stripped of his professional licenses, and ordered to repay the misused funds. The family's reputation, once pristine and envied, crumbled overnight. Friends stopped calling. Business partners distanced themselves. The family name, once a badge of pride, became a whispered cautionary tale. I thought victory would feel triumphant, but it didn't. It felt peaceful, like setting down a burden I had carried for far too long. When the estate was finally divided as Grandpa had intended, the lawyers handed me a bank draft and a set of property documents. I stared at them for a long time. The money, the land, the house, it all seemed hollow compared to what I had really gained. Justice wasn't about wealth. It was about reclaiming truth. So I made a decision. I didn't keep the money for myself. I used a portion of it to restore the old countryside house, Grandma and Grandpa's home. The paint had peeled, the roof sagged, and the peach trees out back had grown wild, but the bones of the house were still strong. I hired local carpenters, the same men who'd worked for Grandpa years ago. Together, we brought the place back to life. As I walked through the renovated halls months later, the scent of fresh wood mingled with the lingering memory of cinnamon and lavender. I imagined Grandpa standing by the window, smiling that quiet, knowing smile. I could almost hear his voice. "Proud of you, kiddo. You did what I couldn't." I turned the house into a foundation, the Harold and June Memorial Home, a place for elderly care and community gatherings. It was exactly what Grandpa had dreamed of doing before illness stole his time. Every room held a piece of their memory. Grandma's teacups in the kitchen, Grandpa's books in the study, the photo of their wedding framed above the fireplace. I invited Grandma to move in, and though frail, she agreed. The day she arrived, she wept as she touched the doorway. "He would have loved this," she whispered. "He does," I said. "He's here." For months after the verdict, my parents didn't speak to me. I didn't expect them to. Sometimes silence is the only language left after truth. I heard from distant relatives that my father sold his company shares to cover legal fees, and that my mother stopped attending her social clubs. Their world had collapsed under the weight of their own deceit. I didn't celebrate it, but I also didn't mourn it. Justice isn't revenge. It's balance restored. One spring morning, a year after everything ended, I visited Grandpa's grave. The sun filtered gently through the peach blossoms, their petals falling like snow. I knelt beside the headstone, tracing my fingers over his name. "They changed the papers, Grandpa," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But they couldn't erase your truth." The wind stirred the trees, carrying the scent of blossoms and the faint hum of bees. For a moment, I could almost feel his presence beside me, the warmth of his hand, the steadiness of his faith. I closed my eyes, and peace washed over me. When I stood, I looked back at the memorial home, the windows glowing with afternoon light, laughter drifting from inside where volunteers and residents shared stories. Grandpa had once told me that real inheritance isn't what you receive, it's what you preserve. Now I understand. As I walked away, I realized something profound. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a quiet act, a decision to rebuild instead of destroy, to honor instead of hate. My father had tried to define legacy through control. I had learned to define it through truth, and that truth would live on. Unshakable, unerasable. That night, as dusk settled over the countryside, I stood under the peach tree, its blossoms glowing soft pink in the fading light. The air was warm, fragrant, alive. I whispered into the wind, "It's over now, Grandpa. We're home." And in the stillness that followed, the branches swayed gently, as if answering me. Soft, forgiving, eternal.